Good afternoon. Today's Tuesday, isn't it? Tuesday, June 27th, 2023. And this is the Policy Committee meeting of the West Bend School District. Just as a matter of introduction, we have board members John Donaldson, I'm Chris Swiger, Chad Temez, and then also Superintendent Jen Wimmer are here. So why don't we get started? And we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, we'll move directly into our discussion items. On our agenda, we have discussion of policies in both the 800 and 900 series. So we're going to start with the 800 series, and Superintendent Wimmer is going to walk us through that.
Correct. So recall we started this conversation in May, and I think we'll, fingers crossed, be able to finalize the 800 and 900 tonight attached, probably for ease in viewing. There's an attachment there that picks up with 852, which is where we left off before, and we can kind of roll through that as a packet. So that's where we're at. 852 is the distribution of non-school sponsored information, and what that looks like is most often youth leagues, scouts, things of that nature, or community events where they're contacting us and asking for us to distribute information. We don't provide copies for them of that information. If they wanted to provide a copy, they could once it's authorized, but our process right now is everything has to come through the Office of the Superintendent. It should display a statement on the bottom saying that this is not our organization necessarily, but it just goes through, you know, that there's approval, so that principals or secretaries aren't receiving the direct item and then turning that around, and then that they know that there's some kind of authorization. Also in our communications, we have a community section in our news for our families, so that we're able to, if someone's given us a community event, something like that, it's going into that section, alerting them that it's a community piece of information. So we try and include that, because oftentimes if things were distributed, maybe, you know, around a youth league, et cetera, we try and repost those in community, so families, you know, like if they can't put their finger on it, they can always go back and visit our archive of the community events and see what's there too. I think in the biggest pieces, there is no template for it, kind of this distribution piece. The most recent that I found from an alternate agency is right behind it. There's a sample from Mequon Thiensville that talks about. So I'm just showing you some samples of some language. Ours hasn't been updated in quite a while. So just showing you sample language. Again, WASB doesn't create a template, but in WASB's key considerations for policy, we want to make sure that it's clear what would be, what we would consider okay communication, what's prohibited, and if we deny those out of my office, is there an appeal or is there anything like that? We have never had any issue with that, so sometimes what I hold the line on is I'll get the influence of sales or marketing materials, and we don't distribute those things. So even if it's partnered with a community event, there's a recent store and it's like, hey, we happen to have this going on, and it accompanies our big sale for whatever. No, we're not going to distribute that because that's a crossover of kind of the marketing piece for that. So we're just looking at organizations, but you want to have some clear parameters. You do want something in policy, and you want some clear parameters to meet tests, so that I'm not beholden to have to distribute something that I feel, you know, isn't going to meet that test, and how do we have that? So I'm not going to, you know, like, I would be hard pressed. Something that's going to try and solicit kids in some way for engagement in activities that are unlawful, or, you know, again, I don't know who would propose that, but you never know. You just want to have policy written so that it meets that test. So I'd urge you to just take a look kind of around our current policy, and then other language, and see if there's any intersection or things that you want to make sure we're real clear on.
So I'm assuming that since there are changes recommended, that there are provisions in here that have been troublesome or
No,
problem for administration, staff?
correct, no, it's giving us the right to, kind of meet the test of the educational needs or the mission of the district, that's pretty broad and kind of, we know those parameters. It allows the district to reserve the right to disallow anything, that we would say conflicts. So again, I've had no issue. They all contain the phrase, the opinions expressed are not sponsored or endorsed by the West Bend School District or its personnel, so that they meet those needs. So again, no issues, but I just wanted to make sure, since it hadn't been updated, to present some other language in case there was something in there that you liked or saw that you would want to replicate.
Other questions on this policy? Just one kind of final comment, because coming from the private sector, if an employee wants to put up a poster about an upcoming event or community event or runs it, we have the right to say yes or no. As a governmental agency, there are all sorts of free speech rights, and so this is an important policy, because otherwise it could be, dare I say, a free-for-all. And
You're
so
correct, there's an intersection of free speech and how and when, so if we're very clear on what needs to be included, which sponsoring organization, that it's not our agency, what's prohibited, which there's a list below on things that are prohibited, and again, we have the right to do that, and I don't think there should be an appeals process and lengthy. It should be yes or no, it meets the test or it doesn't. And again, no issues with this language, just making sure, specifically if you look at number 6 where it's listing out kind of what's prohibited, if there's any other language.
no, it's like this has been long-standing. It's just adopted in '82, so it's gone through a couple of iterations. I don't have any other questions. Others? Comments? All right. I think we move to the next one.
Great. The next is a general 860, visits to schools. It hasn't been updated since 2016. Right behind that, you find the updated WASB language for your review.
There's a typo on
Oh, thanks.
the last sentence of the first page.
Okay.
The individual board member should be
Oh,
may.
I see. Board member visits are also covered in the 100 series guiding you, so it's a replication of that expectation.
So the existing language really is more generic. The WASB updated language looks like it has a specific section on board member visits, so it kind of covers the general and the specific, correct?
Yeah, and that's just covering under visitors. Again, your board member visits are also contained in the 100 series around board member scope and authority with the same expectation. So you can include it here or not. It's really the discretion of the board.
There's language in the WASB policy, well, both policies I think are good. The final paragraph before the board member visits, and I think is good language to have. Regardless of the time of day, the district administrator or building principal or district designee has a discretionary authority to exclude from the school premises any person the district determines has no legitimate and approved purpose for being on school grounds, disrupts, appears to be disruptive. And I would think we would want that. And although that's somewhat perhaps generically covered in the existing language, I think that's a good right for the administrators to have. And I would assume that's what they're doing today.
Correct.
It's just that it's not specific.
Correct. It's just not in the updated language.
Others, do you have a question or a preference between the existing language or the new language? And I think, or the proposed or the WASB language, I think the board member visits section, if that's covered in a different policy, duplication, whether to make sure they're consistent or we should just have it in one place.
Yeah, it's under access, I just found it, it's 161, access to schools, district operations, again, scheduling visits in advance relative to those pieces. So
Mhm.
again, I think that it's just a cross-reference. I think you could easily strike it here because your actions are guided under another set of policies.
Mhm.
So we can strike that portion of it? The board member visits?
That would be my
Knowing it's
thought
contained-
If it's redundant.
If it's
It
redundant.
is,
Otherwise, if we ever update it, we'd have to remember to update it in two
Yep.
places, so.
perfect.
I think it's
Strike that.
cleaner to have it under the
Board authority.
Board authority policy.
Mhm.
I'll agree. Did we already go over those recently?
Yes.
We did.
Yeah, the 100s, yeah.
I guess I would like, I would like to see, I guess a little bit more authority for board members to go to schools without a huge set of plannings. I think they should have the same authority as the administration of going to schools and walking through and, possibly just popping in and doing a quick inspection and making sure you're covering all your board bases. Your authority gives you the right to oversee the entire district, and that's part of it. And just down the road, I would like to, maybe think about doing something like that, or see what the board thinks about
Let's put that as a takeaway.
updating that.
Yeah, let me redo the language right now. Again, no intention for hoops, but it's, if you're coming in to visit as a board member, one, you're wearing dual hats as a parent. You can always go in as a parent anytime, but if you're coming in as a board member, you should schedule your visit in advance with the relevant building principal or district administrator.
Yeah, I'm not completely disagreeing with that, John, with that sentiment, John, but we have to be careful because we have to rewrite the language. If you look at the second half of board member visit
Yeah.
by board members.
And I'm not
shall
talking
be-
this one. And if we're striking this out, I'm totally fine with that, since we are being a little bit redundant with it already in
Yeah.
161. But I'm just saying for the future,
Is the language the same in 160? Do you know?
I just read it to you.
Okay.
I just read you the
So
They
it-
refer
language.
to the same.
It's not, so that
Yeah.
does not include and not as inspectors or visits for supervisory purposes?
Correct. I mean, you can't act in that manner in isolation unless the board has agreed and you're all doing that for some reason, so that isn't a purpose that you could. But it just talks about scheduling that in advance.
Okay.
Well, why don't we, it
Just
sounds
put
like,
161 back, either for review or take some time to review it individually and
Exactly.
provide
Yeah.
feedback.
exactly, let's do that.
Okay.
That predated my time here, so.
Yeah, that's all right.
So I think what we're thinking is for this, we would propose adopting the WASB language,
Correct.
subtracting board member visits, and we'll put
Yep.
board member visits on for a discussion item in the future.
Yes, perfect.
Great.
will we have a reference in there
A reference to,
for anybody that sees this and doesn't
I
know
can-
there's a board member section?
I can put it in there.
I don't know if it is.
Yeah, I can put it in on the bottom where I add, when I tag in the legislative references and all of that. I can put a cross in it
Yeah.
and just a reference.
Maybe just
So,
something board member
reference. Yep,
policies covered under 116.
yeah, I can do that.
A breadcrumb, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'll put it
That's a
instead
good
of in
idea.
the policy language, but in the cross-reference legal section. Perfect. The next one is 872, which is citizen complaints. The following language so this is our current, that's in the front with different steps and all of those pieces. Right behind it is 870, which is WASB's public complaints. That's the correct number, as well as the most updated language. I also put in there the top part of the updated language. You'll see in all caps, I say for consideration in sample rule. That's just providing more detail. You can integrate that language as a rule, or you can integrate it right into the policy. So you just need to dissect parts and pieces of what we have currently, what the updated language is, so that I can kind of bring them all together.
So I've not compared to every word, it appears that the two policies have a relatively consistent process.
Correct.
It starts with
Yep.
the application of the complaint,
Mhm.
the review, and then ultimately, if needed, an appeal.
Correct.
So 870 appears to also be, it seems to be talking more about staff complaints than board-specific complaints.
So there's a piece of that. We have multiple complaint policies, and they're kind of by bucket. So you have them in the 411 around equal education. There's complaint procedure embedded in there. There's anti-bullying and anti-harassment. There's for students, for staff. There's a staff conduct complaint one, and there's a grievance procedure as well as this one. So each kind of group has a bucket. So we determine, are they making a complaint as a staff member, or are they making a complaint as a citizen? It's not who they're complaining about, it's what their role is. So each kind of role has its own procedural in policy.
So in section B, district response to a public complaint. Number one, staff will respond to complaints or appropriately handled by another employee. I'm just,
So I'm in receipt of a complaint, someone comes to you, you're the math teacher, you know, whatever, like, hey, you need to go to the science teacher, of which you had this conversation. You need to go to the principal of your building, you're getting them to the closest. But if you're, as a reader, questioning that, then the language needs to be cleaned up.
I'm only questioning it because the 872 appears to
Correct.
speak more specifically to the board.
So in 872, when you look at the Board of Education, are you looking at their role in resolution or complaints about the board?
Complaints about the board versus complaints about staff.
Okay,
So I just want to, I mean, I understand the process may be similar, but it looks like the WASB language doesn't really address complaints about the board at all.
So this would be, I think, some language that existed in our district and included the board. To your point, you know, if it's about the board from the public, we need to dive into that section. That's the only recommendation I have, is when you look at the Board of Education, and if people are making complaints about the board in some way, how you resolve that, there's just some steps in here that need to be cleaned up, I would say, because it talks about you know, how the board then can engage in discussion about that complaint, and we still need to follow all the laws around meetings, et cetera, and that discussion.
Yeah, so I guess, I think you're saying the same thing I am, that the WASB language in the 870 policy, I don't have a problem with the procedure, but maybe we should have a subsection that deals specifically with board
Yeah,
complaints.
so take a look at our current, and then walk through what process we would follow. Is it different if it's about a board member? How does it differ? And what are our recommendations? So it's a page 4, number 5 of our current policy. So the issue around there is when you can go in and out of closed session, how you would handle that. That's questionable.
So under section B of the WASB language, under number 4, the paragraph under that, it does address board members receiving complaints.
That's if you're receiving, not if the complaint is about you. So it's very different. In our current policy, we're tackling both all in one.
Correct, yeah, so this is just if someone were to complain to me about something at school. That makes sense.
But it's different if they're complaining to me or Chris about a board member.
Correct. That is not in the WASB language.
Right.
Specifically.
Correct, so
So we should implement, so I don't think the process needs to be much different, other than the board's role in addressing the complaint.
So what I would recommend, just knowing after my review of our current language, and there's some questions that would stick out to me for legal reference, I can approach them, say we're interested in including this section. They'll either make a recommendation to me to preserve it in this section, or perhaps put it in the board section of the 100s and have them support creating some draft language that looks at our existing and kind of makes that a little bit more cleaned up.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Chad, you're right, the proposed WASB language is decent, a bit more generic. I like the idea of incorporating something that's more specific and step-by-step for board complaints, should we get one.
Yeah, and I think as far as how they're resolved, I think that a complaint about a board member should be addressed through the channels discussed, and if it gets to a dispute about whether or not the complaint is being handled appropriately, or if we're not able to reach a conclusion, it would make sense then if that complaint were to be brought back to the board, to the full board, but I would think that decorum would suggest that that would be done in executive session first, with then the result being given.
Yes
So
and no.
discussion in executive with the
So
result.
you have very specific statutes of when you can and can't go into executive session on certain things. So we would want to kind of go through some scenarios with legal and have them know, and then what our authorization is, what language would be used, and how that would be done.
Because a staff complaint that came to the board, I'm assuming would be discussed in executive session.
That could be an employment matter. which
Yeah,
you don't have
because,
to-
yeah, I can tell you that.
Right.
We
But I'm
don't
just
employ
saying,
you.
That's what I'm saying,
We
that's where the
don't,
language
yeah,
is
that's
to be-
where we have to
but-
get that.
But I think, yeah, so we should ask legal about it, because I would assume that you would want to extend the same courtesy
Correct.
to anyone else discussion
Correct.
wise. I think
Keep
that,
that
I think that
private.
the result is certainly open to public,
Yeah.
whatever, however you want to report that, but the discussion matter probably should be extended in the same fashion you would discuss a staff complaint.
Why do we want to keep it private? I mean, I see for the staff side, but the board were elected officials, and I would say, I would be totally fine with if we had an open discussion, just because they're just, we're not giving the visibility into what's going on, the community. Not that I'm saying I completely disagree or anything, I'm just, trying to give the other side of it, like, I'm all for, just being able to see what's going on in the district and kind of all the aspects. If we're an elected official and somebody wants to make their next decision on what's going on, and they have no idea, I'm just saying it could be something that could be, a bit kind of hidden.
I hear you, and I think ultimately, when we look at the open meetings statute,
Yeah.
that may answer the question. It's
I think
it's very possible
I
that
think
we
it
would
will.
not be able to do that,
Yeah.
to go into closed session, but
I
it would be
think-
good to know what options are and are not.
Yeah, and what I can engage them on, certainly they're gonna, they're serving all districts in that manner and watching those cases, that we're interested in a level of visibility around positions with, in their elected capacity, and how do we talk about that, what's the best way to engage in that, what could that look like, and how policy language could guide that.
Yeah, so mostly, John, my concern would just be not engaging in a public forum about things that could potentially end up just being rumor, speculation, conjecture, hearsay, slander, things like that, that now are out in the public. I'm certainly open. I think it would be absolutely appropriate to give the result of the complaint, should that be something that's a public issue.
Yeah, and I get that. I just reading through this, it sounds like it goes through quite a few other channels before it gets to that point.
Yeah.
And superintendent's gonna have a lot to say, or,
We have to
information they
investigate.
get in investigation, so,
Yeah.
when it gets to that point, I think it's a pretty set in stone. There was a actual complaint, and it's valid. That's just the way I'm reading how this response and, the procedures go for this stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm open to that as well. I'm comfortable doing that as well. I just didn't want a board meeting to turn into
Well, and it does
Yeah.
say that the board member is actually not allowed to be a part of it, so they probably have to be excused during that part of the meeting.
They can and can't, there's different
Okay.
pieces. A lot of times, I'm investigating and resolving, and bringing that resolution, and,
So,
first in kind of when you're sitting as a citizen, when you're sitting as a board member, when you're, and kind of talking through
Yeah.
those pieces.
I'm just, at least it wouldn't become a big debate, between the person the accuser and
Yeah.
people kind of confronting
Yeah.
the situation, so.
a,
I wouldn't see it getting to be a huge, fiasco in the middle of a board meeting, because that person technically.
Yeah, why don't I just talk with them about kind of what we're interested in seeing and have them develop some language for us to review, with that in mind. The other piece is, I'll have them look at it nested or see if they have a recommendation that it go into the 100 series in any way. So I'll ask them for that recommendation on that. And then bring those forward. Any other questions or
Good discussion.
comments about that? Great,
sounds good.
yeah. In the next. So many pages. Now to scroll through. And again, we'd be renumbering, and doing that.
I'm Gregory at page 12-ish.
Yep, so you're looking at the relations with community organizations, governmental agencies. So recall I foreshadowed that we have multiple, 881.2, 882, 883, 891.2. They're all talking about our relationship with organizations. So if you kind of look at 880, right behind it is what's your relationship with the PTO, in general. The one piece we don't have on here that we have to look at is in 881.2 is citizens advisory committees, and what language we want carried over into that umbrella. I just left everything kind of where it was. Fire department, so I think let's rule out the ones I think that are easy to rule out. Fire department, 883, it's talking about our obligation to do fire drills and to report them. That's state statute, we have to be in compliance, we have to report that to multiple agencies as a compliance issue, so it's not necessary to be here. It's also part of the drills in your safety plans. And then safety plans are governed by a board policy that they have to be up to date, and that's a requirement of those. So I think it's unnecessary to have fire department as its own agency.
Do we currently have, this might be a little off topic, but speaking of the fire, the safety plans and stuff, do we have like an emergency response team within the students that help out with that? Or is that just all staff?
All staff,
Okay.
all staff.
Is it ever an option to include them, or if we wanna get kids involved? I know,
It may.
everywhere I work has like something like that. It's kinda-
Yeah, well, and that piece of you as an employee being engaged in that, I think now that we have kids who are being certified as EMTs, and then we're looking at bringing up they're generally called explorers programs or anything like that, to get some certifications in first responding, then we've got an avenue there
Sure.
for our kids to participate or, alongside. The only thing is you could put kids in violation of FERPA and all of that if they're responding to a situation and they're looking at a kid in
Yeah.
crisis, having a medical condition.
I was
or
more
staff
thinking
member.
fire drill than helping guys,
Yes, yeah.
if they are, I mean, yeah. it
Yeah,
might
then
be
they're part of,
some
that's not an
senior
emergency
level and-
response team.
maybe looking to go into that field might be helpful.
Yes, we're, our West Bend
Oh, cool.
Fire Department is actually very interested. Tim Harder and I have been working with them around bringing up more of an Explorers Academy, so that they get direct entry into the next level of training, to be certified as a fire, in fire. They also are EMT and paramedic, so we're giving our kids right now with the EMT program, just a leg up that they can have that pre-certification. They're that much closer to paramedic. So when you're looking to be a firefighter, they are ready for a firefighter 1 to hit the ground running for their certifications and entry. Good
Can I-
questions? Mhm.
Can I ask you a question about paragraph A? It says, once each month,
Mhm.
you have a drill. Do we do that?
Yeah, you have to. by
Once a
law.
month?
Once a month. You can replace
Wow.
one, so even in winter.
Really?
So, and they have to be unannounced, so sometimes you're like, come on in, kids, no, leave your coats on, come sit down,
Mhm.
because we're in Wisconsin. So you're always looking, or, you know, I'll send out like, wow, it's, you know, like 60 in, you know, February, like, guess what's happening? So we kind of watch each other's back, but you can replace one with an alternate drill of a lockdown drill, but you still have to have your lockdown drill. Even if you replace that one, you still have to have it supervised and reported, and those get reported to the board and authorized, and then again, that's a compliance piece.
Wow, this
So
was
you have to
adopted.
have so we have to do that here as well, even though people would perceive we're an office building, because we house students. So we still have one every single month, even when school's not in session. All your summer school sites have to have them while they're in session. And again, we're reported, and we really do.
Wow, well, thank you for that, because
You didn't realize
where
that.
I went to public high school, we didn't do that once a month, so we'll just, I won't name,
been
I won't name my
around.
alma mater to
It's
protect
been around
them,
for quite a while.
but, okay, thank you for that.
The next one is other educational organizations. That's really getting at charter, parochial, private schools, all of those pieces. And in that umbrella language, I've got community organizations and businesses. They'd be considered an organization in the community. If you want them called out as other educational organizations in that umbrella one, or private, parochial, all of that, so that they're called out specifically, that's fine. Also, statutes govern the work that we do. I think a lot of people may not realize that we serve those schools. We provide their transportation. We work in collaboration for their lunch programs. We do their child-defined activities. We do their site services. We provide speech and language, other special ed consults. So there's quite a history. I work with that network when we're looking at closure, when we're, our next task we're gonna do together is calendar development. We also work together, all of your federal funds, we're kind of a flow-through agency. We give their cut as private schools, so it comes into us and we work with them. So we have a coordinator that works with all the schools and ensures that that's happening. And then we open up some of our professional development to them as well. All that's guided by regulation too. So if you'd like in that umbrella, if we want to call out and just say, in addition to private, parochial, all of that in partnership, or educational organizations, so it's a little more than implied, I think that's an easy fix. But the pieces in the current language, those are all, we do that
That's all
and
governed by
more.
statute.
Yeah, we do all that and more.
So your thought is,
It's,
back on page 12, the original school community relations proposed language, that we would amend that to specifically
Yeah.
call out perhaps.
yep, so right in there,
Other
third
schools.
line down, you have community organizations and businesses. So you could choose to say educational organizations, as well as other organizations in the community, or you could call out, you know, the private, parochial, you know, any of those kind of things, but I think I'd generalize it to education would be my recommendation, because you have all types of schools now. You can have voucher schools, charter schools, choice schools, like all different ones. So I think just educational might be good. Otherwise,
Well,
they're included in community organizations, so it's just if you want to call out the educational ones.
it does say the board encourages partnership with the school organization, i.e. education foundations, parent, teacher organization. Education foundations wouldn't be included in those?
The what?
education foundations wouldn't be, I guess that might be something different.
So this is Cabrini, this is Kettle Moraine Lutheran, this is the actual schools. So you could put it, to your point, John, we could put it right in those parens, for example, those schools as well.
If you wouldn't mind supplying an updated draft, inserting, educational organizations, because John, I agree
Yep.
that educational foundations probably refers to more kind of like the nonprofit organizations, like the,
After I read it, I thought of that.
it's okay, no, it's all right, these are all so closely aligned. And if we were able to get some updated wording on that,
I would do that.
That would be great.
Educational organizations business. So again, that would take care of this policy, the one
Mhm.
around visits, right? So I'm just kind of knocking them off, making sure we've got them back and forth.
Just we provide transportation for Kettle Moraine Lutheran.
So we're able to provide transportation to your private and parochial schools in, with a certain radius around,
Within the radius.
outside, yep, and outside of
Not
our,
everywhere.
outside of our footprint. You have to go so many miles beyond your border to do pickups and stuff.
Yeah,
That's why it's so
existed for a while.
critical, as we work together, and again, we have a great relationship. I've been to those schools, we're very connected, and sharing things. In really looking at a next step on some calendar alignment. Any day that our calendars differ cost almost $20,000 in transportation costs to us. So.
So if we're closed and they're open, or vice versa, or well.
Correct,
yeah.
yep, correct. They generally start earlier, we're bound by state statute when we can start, but again, when I reached out this past spring, we have a calendar in effect for next year, but as we look to develop the next iteration of a calendar, everyone's all in to kind of work together and see what we can do, so, yeah, we really all look at our role as we're serving communities, and support parent choice in that, so. So again, looking at that, going back to 881.2, I think it's just carrying over the parent organizations, the PTOs, PTAs, that's named. It's citizens advisory committees. How do we want to state that? Do we want it to have, generally citizen advisory committees are things we're putting together. So it really depends on what that is. So take a look at that language specifically and let me know what you want me to carry over. Or if you want me to develop some language that it's its own around citizens advisory. An example of a citizen advisory would be the county has a health committee. And they're putting together some recommendations. They're working on mental health, they're working on drug and alcohol abuse, those pieces. We sit on those committees. Most of our committees, we're engaged in some way. They might need to have an educational rep. I'm the educational rep for the County Traffic Safety Commission. We're engaged in all different boards, that kind of thing. So just take a look. The only other advisory committee I know of was, I think they call themselves the Citizen Advisory Committee for the facilities.
I'm torn because I think it's great to have the option available for citizens advisory committees. The way that this is worded, on the one hand, what I like is it's very flexible. Set it up,
Yep, you want
specific
that.
purpose, so flexibility is good. I wonder if it's deserving of its own policy. I mean, it's something that's different around kind of you're establishing an organization. It's almost as if you're saying we've got to establish a charter for them. What are they able to do? What are they not able to do? They really
Correct.
aren't able to bind the district per se,
Correct.
generally speaking. So those are my immediate thoughts, but what are you, recommendation?
You may have this in, when I look at some of the 100 series, 185, what are the board committees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you may be pulling together ad hoc committees, you may be putting that, so, perhaps it's making sure that 185 has what it needs in there for the board, because it's referencing committees. I think there was one other place where we referenced some ad hoc things, because again, you do want the flexibility to pull those in.
Yeah.
And be part of, either we're sitting on them or they are authorized with a purpose from our board.
So I'm not offended by or troubled by the language that exists. I just think for sure we
Neither.
want to maintain some flexibility. I think this has been a problem. So either way, I don't want to lose that.
So where it's talking about advisory committees, I'm just wondering if we should look at kind of the intersection, because this to me is, the way it's written and where it's sitting, this is, the community has come up with a citizens advisory committee. Right? But then that first line where we're adopting structures and committees, that's back in a 100 around committees.
Yeah. The
You know,
185,
So,
right?
yeah, so it's hard to tell what it's trying to get at. So for us, you're encouraging us to call upon community citizens for advice, expertise, that's also nested in multiple other, you know, like the curriculum process, the, you know, all these other pieces, and your committee structure in 185.
Yeah, that's.
This feels like it's sitting under citizen, but it's really meaning an extension of a committee that the board is setting up with scope and purpose. So I just need, you know, if anyone's reading it differently.
I think the idea of this policy's relations with community organizations and governmental agencies, and we're talking about citizen committees, which is an important concept,
Mm-hmm.
but is that necessarily a relation with a community organization? You know, it's,
The other ones where there's really true citizens advisory and other, that's with the organization. It's the health department, it's the city, it's the county, there's an organization with it. I think this, when I read this language, I'm interpreting it under the scope of the board, and it may be more well-served fleshing out 185 to include that this is, again, the board seeks to engage representation from its community, all of that, revisiting that. So I think just like the other one, maybe we look at getting this concept in 185, and then doing the cross-reference where that scope of really engaging the community is present. So it's understood that that's something that the board wants to support and promote.
well, and that would also make sense, because if I were a member of the public, and if in the future we set up a committee like this, and I look through the table of contents, would I go to relations with community organizations, governmental agencies, or would I go to board committees? It would seem-
No, nor would you have gone to the parent school organizations policy.
Yeah.
It's just kind of tagged in.
It's, the foundation of the language is good, and I don't want to lose it. Let's
Yeah. All right,
let's
let me
take a
bring
look
it
at our
back as
recommendation.
185,
what it looks like.
and push it in there. So we have language around committees in there, so let me kind of marry those two, so we don't lose that, and it is real clear to the public that it's something we value and seek to engage in. Does that work?
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
We'll see you right back.
All right, the next one I'm gonna say is a standalone. It's, while it says relations with law enforcement agency, that's not what this policy is at all. So I'm gonna say set aside that for now. So going back, those policies that we just talked about, does this 880 meet kind of the umbrella of the expectations? We'll add the educational organizations in. Good with that piece?
Yes.
And tweak the citizens.
Yep, citizens will come back in
Advisory committee.
185.
Yes.
Perfect, okay. Now I'd like you to take a look at 882. This is a current policy. 882 says it's relations with law enforcement agencies, but it's not. It is actually what we would label as 445, which is student interviews with law enforcement officials or outside agency personnel, okay? So right behind that, I've given you what updated language for 445 looks like. I've cross-referenced it with our MOU with the police department. I've checked in with the chief of the police department, and I'm providing you some sample language for 445 around interviews. There are times at which law enforcement, or most likely social services, comes to schools to interview students.
So 445 is not a policy that currently exists.
Not at all.
Got it. But the idea would be where,
This is, so 882, the intention is around how law enforcement engages with students in interviews. But again, it's more than that, it's outside agencies that may interview students. So that is actually 445,
Got it.
appropriately numbered. So I brought forth the most recent WASB language around that, and then I did checks and balances against our established MOU for school liaison officers and checked in with chiefs on making sure the language was aligned. So there are some cases specifically with abuse and neglect. Those interviewers are coming from social services. They check in with the office, they follow visitor parameters, they do all that. Everything is done privately. You know, you're not making a commotion to pull kids out of class, that kind of thing, and you're providing a space for them to interview should they need to. Again, that's where that outside agency gets involved.
and now with that context, and now when you read it, the relations with law enforcement agencies, if this current policy 882 would have quit after the first paragraph, it would have been great.
Correct. The rest is just rather dated.
Yeah, and so the rest talks about the interviews, and I agree.
It-
That's not,
yeah.
that's not a relation with the community, with the
Right.
community law enforcement agencies. That does deserve its
No.
own segregated
Correct.
policy.
And you could also, like, I could craft it so it's outside agency and law enforcement, but those are the two entities that come to our doorstep to interview students in
And-
some form or fashion.
Is this wording in alignment with current statutes? Because I'm sure there's statutes around interviewing a minor without parental consent, that kind of stuff.
Correct.
So I'm
And it
assuming this
follows
is
the
all
legality,
fine.
yeah, because at some point, I can't interfere with an investigation too. So if it's law enforcement coming for some reason, they've done, you know, their steps. Again, really proud of the collaboration with Jackson as well as West Bend. They've done their due diligence. If something can be avoided, so it's not school hours, that kind of thing, that's fine. If it's us calling law enforcement for some reason, there's nuances to that, but we also can't interfere with their investigations. But, you know, if it's an outside event and we're not calling, they've done due diligence to, you know, see if they can't do their investigation or interviews off campus, outside of school hours. And that also talks about protection of the learning environment in this new language.
Well, actually, the revised language 445, one of the things I like about it is in the existing policy, it's very proscriptive, which on the one hand, you think, oh, that's good. But on the other hand, for instance, paragraph 2A, we talk about efforts made by law enforcement officers to minimize school disruption by conducting plainclothes interviews wherever possible. Sounds good on the surface, certainly, but we can't by policy bind the police.
Correct. They would supersede me
So
on
instead,
that. I can't interfere.
So instead, as further evidence of the example, in the new policy, it more generically says, do it in a way that minimizes disruption of the student's school day, minimizes disruption of functioning of the school, and minimizes distraction. And I think it would be good to say, well, those are our goals, but the police need to work under the police department's authority
Yeah.
and state statutes.
And if we're putting in language that it's when possible, efforts are made to, I think that covers us, that's that, but we also know and understand our obligation to stand aside. In our MOU, the notification of the guardians, those kinds of things, the police take on that responsibility. So that's in our MOU, and I could restate it here. So adding a line around, it's the law enforcement's responsibility to notify parents and guardians, to show that that's there. That the law enforcement is taking that on, that they take, that's right in our MOU, and the chief has no problems with inserting that around the notification, that they take responsibility for that piece.
Yeah, I'd say if our law enforcement partners are okay with it and
They
it's
are
bound by
very
the MOU, then they are bound to do it.
But to Chris's point, this is the relations with community and governmental agencies. Are we gonna keep that top portion as a relational
So that's just an
Or added
intro.
into it?
Yep, that's just an intro, I took it out. So 882, I'm saying that's completely a wrong number, wrong title. It should become 445, which is, recall that's students, that's our engagement with students. That's where this belongs. So to your point, John, no, it's not about the relationship, it's around interviewing specific.
I think,
And it goes into the students.
But I'm saying we went over a whole list of the school community relations.
yeah, the schools.
Are we adding, we're not gonna add that piece up
So
into
the
there?
880,
Just a small,
you're gonna go back to the 880 umbrella one, is
Yeah.
what you're saying?
Do we reflect, I think John's question is, do we reflect old language 882, the very first paragraph, to ensure the safety, we encourage close cooperation with law enforcement agencies?
just on the umbrella of it.
Do we preserve that in the umbrella policy that we talked about, relations with private and parochial
Yeah, and
schools?
redo the safety piece, restate the safety.
Yeah, if there is,
Yeah, we're bringing that back with the educational organization, so you want to replicate the piece around law enforcement as well,
Or at
right?
least have something
In the
in there
880.
just stating that. I think it would just be, yeah,
Just add it in the
Yeah.
umbrella.
I don't think it's
Gotcha.
redundant, I think we're taking it away as kind of a, kind of a statement piece, for our law enforcement community relations.
Could
It
I,
would just be nice to have it up there.
yeah, I don't disagree. Could I ask you to take a look at the two first paragraphs? Because what I would want to do is not create new language, but I might just want to replicate the language
Mhm.
in 445. So can you take a look at those two openers and just let me know which one you want me to carry forward?
so you're looking at, want us to take a look at the opener for,
882, around to ensure safety and well-being, right? We're saying we like that as an opener to add to 880. We also have an opener in that 445. Are there pieces that I should commingle?
got it.
Again, they're not in conflict with each other, but I would just want to have some alignment of language. So
Sure.
just let me know
Hmm?
which are both and I can put those together.
I guess I would be fine just taking that first paragraph out and putting it up in the relations portion and not even having it in 445. Because then it would be redundant.
Okay, so strike the top
That's
paragraph.
just my thought. I mean, everybody else can put their opinion.
Sure.
That's okay.
I don't, it just seems like that is kind of, that is kind of the goal. I think that does kind of state the relationship or the community relationship with it, with the law enforcement agencies and.
Selfishly, I like that suggestion because then you don't have to clean up two pieces when you have cross language.
All right, let's see that, do you mind preparing that proposal?
Not at all. So it's taking the first paragraph, you want just the current 880, cast that forward, or the current 882 opener, cast that forward to the umbrella of 880, strike it out of 445.
Right,
Perfect.
as a committee, we'll have a chance to see that language before we go
Correct.
anyway, so let's give that a try.
Great.
Okay?
I will do that. The one thing that I brought forward separately as it was under relations, that next one is relations with tax incremental finance review boards. So this language is out of date. They're also called TIDs, TIFs. There's multiple things. So we sit on those. Take a look at that. We just had the West Bend update. Andy just attended it. So we sit on tax incremental districts or tax incremental finance review boards. Those are in the municipality in which they serve. Any taxing authority has a seat at the table when those are developed, when they're reviewed, and all of those pieces. So Andy Sarno and I represent the district in that manner. Depending on our schedule. So Andy actually just went and will do a write-up for the board around, they reviewed all the districts for West Bend, and he'll provide that to the board. It's that piece. So when there's new, so if a new one was being developed, I would consult with the board president. I'm looking at the test of that, the implication on those, because what you're doing when you determine, right, you're throwing a net around an area and you're shifting the tax burden for it, which ultimately shifts what money we receive out of that. So anything that's not in alignment with the district, or things when there's new, I'm consulting with the board president, and they may or may not come forward for the full board to have an open discussion around those pieces. So that's kind of our practice around those, again, and then you'll get the update when they provide us they're bound as municipalities to provide an annual update regarding their districts too.
And the TIF process in and of itself is subject to, it's a public
Multiple-
meeting and, right, so it's
Correct.
not like there's something secret, I mean, it's.
No, the obligation is to notice the public from the municipality. We just have a seat at the table for that piece, and it's heavily governed by statute, so we can't influence. It's just around our responsibility to sit at the table, to check in with the board, that it's in alignment, and that we're accurately representing in those cases,
So-
and providing you with the updates when they're provided to us.
So that sets tax burden on that area?
So what a tax incremental district does, so often you see them with maybe a blighted area that they're gonna redo, or something that they're trying to incentivize development on. They'll kind of throw a net around that area, and they may give tax breaks to developers, builders, in exchange for their doing all the improvements to that land, water, sewer, all of that. They're getting a business in that's gonna bring 500 new employees to the area. So municipalities have that ability, but each taxing authority has to come to the table to look at that proposal, to look at that. There's also an outside agency. Generally, I've seen Ellers used in our area, an outside agency that comes to run that process and keep it in compliance. You have to do multiple tests, certain questions that have to be answered before they can move forward in developing that. It's their burden to have the hearings, to make that public, all of those pieces. That's a municipality's burden.
So the effect on the school district or the municipality is if you have, and I know they work in many, many different ways, so what I'm about to say is probably not accurate. I know it's not accurate in all the circumstances, but if there's an empty piece of land and want to put a commercial development on it, it is an option, is it not, that essentially on a map, they draw a line around that vacant property and say, as an incentive, what we're gonna do is we're gonna freeze, so to speak, the taxes on that.
Reduce them in some way.
Yep, the developer will build, but those reduced taxes, that'll be added incentive to pay for, like you were saying, for the water or the sewer.
Sure.
And so on. The good of it is the community's improved.
And then
The
you
temporary downside is those frozen or reduced taxes mean the school district gets
defers
less.
us from getting revenue.
As well as other municipalities.
Correct.
and
But
municipal bodies.
is it worth that, and that's what you have multiple tests and questions you have to ask. So I have been positioned, not in this district, where I go to the table and I vote no, because we, as a team of taxing authorities, you get a seat at that table. So I have voted no on behalf of the district before. So again, it's just when you bring that forward to a board, when you're looking at that, when they're developing new, when you bring that forward, making sure it's meeting all the tests, I'm expressing my concerns, working with my board president or my full board, so that we're casting a vote in those times that we cast a vote, that it's in alignment with.
So you
Where we're at.
are the voice of the district acting at recommendation of the board?
So
Or-
we
or
don't
how does that work?
necessarily, we don't necessarily bring them all forward. The last meeting we had was simply a review of everything that's already in place. We've had a creation of two small areas. I consult directly with the board president. I look at it, does it meet all these tests? In those cases, they did. So I'm moving forward to act on that. If I had questioned, if I had a reason to believe that I should be voting no or looking at something and it needs to come, we would position that as a discussion
Okay.
with the board.
Should we maybe outline when you have independent authority to just be like, here's what we're gonna go and say at this meeting versus
So,
what criteria? Like maybe if it has a direct budget line item impact, it should be a board.
well, anything would have a direct, because it's directing your revenue. I believe that whether or not we sit it in policy or whatever, when I first came, I made our first meeting, I'm like, what are the parameters? Where are they?
Right,
What
so
is that?
we should maybe
They-
we should just outline what the protocol is for how your decisions
You
are.
either have them in policy or procedural manual on what that is, what that test is, and when you bring them forward, and how you stay informed.
We can keep it in, it can be in procedural, I would think, but we would need to then reference that procedure in the policy.
Correct.
Which I
Yep.
don't.
Which would follow right behind it. You just want a flexible enough
Sure.
policy. But I think something is needed, because when I came and I asked the question of people who were representing us prior, I said, well, how do you know how to represent the district?
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, when you introduced this policy to us today, I think you said it needs some help.
It does.
Okay, just want to be sure, so you're open, just
It
want to be
does
sure we're
need
on the
some
same
help.
page.
It does need some help,
Yeah.
because I came with that experience. And I knew, and reached out to my board, made sure I set that expectation and did that.
Yeah.
You need to set it when none of us are at the table in the
Mhm.
future, so that boards know and understand those pieces, especially when you're dealing with not only these creations, but the monitoring of them, you're dealing with dark store stuff, litigations, there's a lot going on in municipalities. That again, they influence us directly in that they talk about revenue. But I could do, because there's little kind of, stock language or something like that. I can go to the organizations, the other organizations that have a seat at the table. MPTC always has a seat at the table. They're the other one receiving tax dollars. I can grab some samples of their procedures and their pieces. I can ask for some legal language and bring that back. But I think it's really important that there's, to your point, a foundation,
We should-
some parameters, and when that gets brought forward to double check.
Yep, that's, agreed, yep, that's exactly what I was looking for, is just that there's something in, some policy that we can actually refer to where it's like, well, that's a decision that should have come back to the full board, or is coming back to the full board.
Right.
Right now, it doesn't exist.
And again,
In
never
policy.
been positioned in my current role, but in the past, I've gone to the table and voted no.
Sure.
So I think that's important too, for people to know, like, there's a process around that.
Now's the time to clean it up.
Yeah.
So
So I'm
I
gonna
think-
grab some other organizations that have seats at the table.
But
Go ahead,
even if you did vote no and the other seats voted yes,
it still
to-
passes.
right, and at that point, we still get deferred tax dollars from that revenue source potentially.
It goes through, just because I voted that way, doesn't
Right.
mean I restored my
So,
revenue stream.
I mean, and in the current situation of the vacant property, you're not really collecting much out there anyways.
Correct.
So it's really not a huge, I'm not saying I disagree with Chad, but, I'm just trying to, get the whole
There-
concept here.
Yeah, no, it's a great
But there's
question.
a lot, there's more, to your point though, there's so many more times that you're voting, like once in my career, I've had to go to a table and vote no, because the positive aspects of the creation of what they're doing and trying to achieve absolutely outweigh, to your point. And there's also a parameter. I mean, I just got a check last year when one TID closed in West Bend, they're paying out the TID, there's a lot of fiscal management of those.
And there's no way to write those or come up to an agreement where if potentially, the district needs the extra revenue, that we can actually just take our chunk and they can defer theirs, really.
No,
That's
Not
unfortunate,
at all.
because, I mean, if a big,
That'd be great.
something was going in and we could plan for that to build another school or something.
Exactly.
Well, it would be
Well,
wonderful.
well-
And people might not realize how much is actually being deferred right now
Mhm.
yeah,
across
well,
all of our
I
municipalities.
know,
it's a-
couple
Mhm.
recently.
yeah, it's a powerful and it's a good tool.
It is.
TIF, it is a good tool, so I'm not criticizing it at all. Just to kind of further illustrate John's point, I think if, correct me if I'm wrong, we start with my example of the vacant land, and we're gonna draw a big square around it, and the municipality says, we are gonna allow I'm making this up, a casino to be put on it.
Sure.
We might say, that really doesn't further a lot of stuff going on with education and what, so we might say, not so, we're not so much in favor of that.
I don't know if they pay taxes, that might not be good.
Right. I was gonna say-
Well,
So,
that's right.
here's
But-
an instance
but-
where I said no. It was luxury apartments and businesses.
Yeah.
And it was commingled on property, all of that, and it's like, do you really need to aid the developer? Why are you aiding the developer? Is there gonna be a bait and switch on, they're getting tax credits in other lanes around housing,
Yeah.
and then they're gonna push in ours and then make it this? Like, you have to, but again, it's very closely guided by statute on meeting those tests and getting that. And then any plans for development, they still have to meet the test of the community.
And I understand, you know, the whole concept of a big businesses moving in, and we
Yeah.
give them, because you're gonna generate jobs that are actually gonna pay taxes right
Absolutely.
away anyways, and all
Homes,
these other things,
families,
so,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah, you want them to
crazy.
come.
There's a lot of,
Yeah, because essentially when, again, it's a powerful tool. You draw the line around it and for, how long do these last? 10 years, 20 years?
Depends.
Yeah.
And then they can do multiple extensions, you can
Yeah,
extend.
there's no tax revenue, gotten on that. But as John said, on the flip side, maybe it brings people into the community and they stay in hotels and there are jobs. And so it's never an easy question.
It's furthering the economic development, and that's why it's, like you said, there's no hard and fast rule, like, oh, if it hits this price, we say no, if it hits this, it's more complex than that. But I think the obligation is to have a shared understanding how we're representing our organization when we come back for discussion, and how we keep the board informed, as representatives in the community as well. Great, I'm gonna work with a couple of those agencies, our legal, to see if they've got some recommendations around how to do that. And some others, if they've got any kind of articulated procedures internally across our public schools too. Good, thank you. I will bring that back then. The next one is originally listed at 8:45. Around naming school district facilities. That's an incorrect number. Naming school facilities actually falls to the 900s, and I've simply brought you the exact templates. I didn't even put them in, just so that we can go through. One is clearly lengthier than the other. Read the opener around what the two samples do in there, that follow our current language. And then let's have a discussion around direction, what we want to see updated. And to be clear, I'm not aware of any established practices outside of what's sitting in policy. And probably the most recent thing that we've named, and none of us were here, was probably the Rolfs Education Center.
So, yes, one is longer than the other. What's interesting is the first policy, the existing language, seems to focus, correct me if I'm wrong, quite a bit on naming rights,
Right.
right? So a major donor or something of the sort. And that's important, I think, to have a policy on that, to consider that. When I look at the naming school facility language, this sample for policy 940, as I read through that, that strikes me as if we wanted to rename a school the George Washington something, or the, John Doe, but whatever it is. Not necessarily a donor, maybe as an honorarium or something of the sort. But maybe, am I reading that wrong?
Correct, no, you're correct. The other piece is around naming rights, Acuity Fieldhouse, Silver Lining Arts Center.
Mhm.
Those are sponsorships and naming and things that generally are set and expire.
Which really is akin to naming rights, right? And that Acuity or West
Yep.
Bend of rights and that, yeah. He talks about, even naming schools. If a new school is constructed, the board may select a name for the school that follows the established. So it even talks about Green Tree, Fair Park. I mean, we are giving that school a name. So this is very,
Let's say we close multiple schools here as part of our facilities plan, and to honor that, we want to rename one of the existing schools that honors a new footprint or something like that. Okay, I mean, generally, they're historical, I don't foresee that, but the board needs to have the discussion around what its beliefs are.
and this does go into talking about a public hearing. Does that mean that the public gets to have a voice in what they potentially want the new name to be?
It,
Is that-
it it depends on the process that the board would like to put in place. And again, this is not on the horizon in any way,
Because I would say, I
but
mean,
it needs to be reviewed.
if it's in a specific neighborhood, that, you know, potentially that neighborhood should have a say in what they might want their kids to, if they don't want, you know, if they don't want to be a,
Mhm.
I don't even know,
Yeah, the
fair
XYZ.
park, whatever it is called, what's their,
Falcons.
what is it?
Falcons,
Is that what
Yeah.
it is?
Fair Park Falcons.
Okay. If
Yeah,
they
'cause you
don't
got the
wanna be
falcon nest.
Falcons, if they wanna be something else, and sounds better, you know,
We get a lot of birds of prey here. We've got the eagles, we've got the
Yeah.
falcons, we've got,
Well, they all use
Isn't that a lot?
alliteration except for Decorah. I'm not sure who fell asleep on that one.
But John, to your point, I think it does, I like the part that says the board shall hold a public hearing, you know, prior to taking action, which I think at least implies, you know, to me, if you're having a public hearing, it would likely be to, you know, hear the public. But I guess we could decide that, but good news, it has that parameter in there.
and you have to talk about kind of the facilities part. It's not just the school, but then how do you tease out a portion or part of the, what if someone wants to approach us and they want we've got a nature center. What's the name on that? What's the name on this part or that part? You know, you're naming parts of your facilities. What's the
Fields.
standard you're going to hold those to? And then we can get into your point around the sponsorship and when are you beholden to that and how do you do that? But I think there just needs to be some,
do you put a monetary value on that? Like, if you donate this much, you get to name it?
you can. That's
I mean-
generally, you usually negotiate those. And it's usually for specific periods of time.
Duration of years.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
I forget the name of, the weight room has its own name,
Hmm.
the field house has a name, the auditorium has a name, you know, all those pieces of our facilities have names and agreements.
It just gets people to start sponsoring
Yeah.
entrance doors and stuff.
Yeah, you know what, okay, I'll do a shameless plug right now, in the field house, within that, there's a wall of sponsorship, and you can connect with the athletic directors, and you can put up a sign. On the outfield scoreboards, for our stuff, there's sponsorship spots all along those, that's taken in under, you have sponsorships, you've got some interplay of the financial procedures, policies, how you can do that, when you can do that, and then there are individual agreements under those umbrellas. But there's opportunity for anyone in the community to sponsor.
I wonder if it makes sense, I like the new language, but I wonder if it makes sense to also kind of import at least the concept of the naming rights in there
Do
as
you
well.
want that to be, I think it goes together
Mhm.
in one policy.
Mhm.
Overall naming and that, so then I'd be bringing back that intersection of those other policies and practices to bring that to you. So it's a concept that the board's in favor of to provide not just sponsorship, but perhaps naming rights and
Yeah,
those
some
agreements.
protocol, some protocol around it.
Okay, so in favor of having those, bringing forward language and what that looks like, and then, we can also look at kind of the current agreements when they expire, those pieces.
Mhm.
Some are in perpetuity, some are time bound.
Now, when we give naming rights, though, there's obviously gonna be boundaries. You can't just name it anything you
Anything
want.
in the world.
That's why you need to set them up
That's why you need
here.
a policy, yeah.
Policy.
That's why I want you to be real
Our
clear
policy.
about what those are.
Yeah, I was.
So chicken or egg, I don't care, but we gotta get this down.
Yes, we have to reserve discretion for the,
So before I'm beholden to the financial part, I always try and set the fence posts with this, going, okay, so what are those beliefs around that?
Which is why community input is certainly valuable and important, but final decision making.
Yeah, we can just say approved by,
Not just
approved by
popular.
board and administration as,
Yeah.
you know, required or something. I don't think someone's gonna come in and name something completely inappropriate.
I mean, we did end up with an ocean explorer named Bodie McBoatface.
Oh, what?
There was naming rights with an ocean explorer vessel, they let the public vote on the naming rights, and it was something silly. So that's why
More
policy is
often-
important to have.
Yeah,
final
policy's
say-so.
important in that, but it kind of, so no different than the policy that we started with, right? What communication will I disseminate? What's
Yeah,
gonna be
and they have a good
then or
example,
not?
yeah, and they have a good example here where they talk about, publicizing some names, having a list of finalists, getting community feedback. I mean, these are all very
Solid process.
reasonable things to do. The board, should absolutely take into advisement community feedback, and I think the names should be, like it says, should be in alignment with current practices of naming, so,
Mhm.
when you're naming the school and the mascot for the elementary schools and the middle schools and things like that, so, I think this policy here, this policy 940 example one here,
The sample
is-
one or sample two?
sample one,
Okay.
I think it does a good job
Mhm.
of hitting the highlights. I mean, we can tweak it to fit whatever language, fits our community, but I think it does a good job of discussing that. I think the second policy is just a wordier version of the same thing, in my opinion.
Oftentimes. Then what I would do as a supplementary piece is put in kind of that intersection of sponsorship, which authorizes some kind of naming rights. So I grab that and push it into here, and when does that come into play? And how is that negotiated?
And in furtherance of Chad's point, one of the sections that I think we should address, and I see is at the end, for instance, of sample policy one, is renaming facilities, because that can be a very, very, very touchy subject.
Oh, everyone loves their schools and what they're named, and, I mean, look at it with Barton, and when you lose that, you lose, school communities lose a sense of identity when they lose their school, their mascot, all of those pieces, so, I mean, it's something to be cognizant of. Are there any other, to your point, Chad, in sample two, it's got some wording, are there some places where you want some extra wording? You like some of those pieces, you want me to kind of marry those two things together?
I think the second policy, it has a little bit more, like, it has a section on renaming facilities that talks about once a facility has been named, that it should not be renamed again. Just some.
And what if someone came in with a huge sponsorship and said, I'll give you $2 million and I want Green Tree named this, and it meets all those tests, would we rename it?
That's why you leave it open for consideration.
See, now you're understanding how policy language works.
Yeah. No, but also with the policy, I think, to the points raised here, it's hard to put every single thing into a rule, but instead
Right.
to establish the process to say things like the public should have an opportunity for input, the board needs to make a decision, here are general factors that should be considered, and so
Perfect.
I think, this is probably lawyer me, I like the wordier policy better, only because there are so many different, well, of course, but this is a policy that we probably aren't gonna be invoking a lot and all the time.
No, you might go the entire,
Duration,
and never invoke it.
right, but there's so many different pieces, and again, we're thinking about this in advance, and laying out the parameters makes sense.
Yeah, and just ours is just outdated.
Yeah, well, it's good to have some room in there. And that's what you're suggesting, in case someone wants to do a Silver Lining Elementary School.
And anybody can approach us because we will consider those things. If anyone likes to finance a new school for us, we're open to that conversation. Are there any specific pieces, Chris, in knowing your love of words, are there any specific pieces out of two you want me to carry forward? Or are we considering number two? What would the board like? Know that I'm gonna add a financial section to it.
Right,
So
yes.
I might recommend that we go with one, but are there some pieces in sample two that, man, this would be good to be carried over? Because then I'll have the financial.
Areas within renaming facilities, no, the rename is in sample policy one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As I'm looking at this, you're thinking about sample one, and then pulling in maybe some pieces of two.
Pieces of two.
as I'm looking at these, I think one does a general job, and although I, sometimes for some things like this prefer more words, why don't we start with one? You're gonna pull in the financial piece, you said. Let's start there.
Let's start with one, pull in the financial. Are there some of the pieces that lay out that maybe might speak to an AR as a company? It's got more detail of the steps.
You could do
Yeah.
that, you could do that with the, like, charter school,
Mhm.
major facilities other than schools. I mean, I think those are just things you could put in that would basically say that the naming criteria for that would still fall under the same, protocols for the main school education buildings.
Mhm.
I think that's fine.
Okay, so what I'm gonna do with this, I'm gonna mock up the sample policy 1, I'm gonna read through policy 2, determine if there's any other pieces of the puzzle that might lend itself to an AR or a process piece that's supplementary, and then I'm gonna pull in the financial sponsorship, and when those aren't agreements, and give us some language around that. And some potential process
That sounds good.
around the financial piece. Chris is thinking.
I am thinking, well, only because
Think away.
I agree with all of that. The thing that popped into my head is, sorry, this is kind of a lawyerly thing. Sometimes, you read about cases where, what would have happened, for instance, if years and years ago, we would have had a very, very generous commercial donor by the name of Enron, who had a school, and we, at the time, we said, that's great, we're gonna name this the Enron Middle School. And then, bad things happen. And now, we're stuck with, well, technically, they've got naming rights. We need to be sure, I think, that we reserve some rights
What are
there.
the agreements? So I'm gonna do the what if, and I think you could put some things around where they would be, out of agreement with the
Right.
expectation. So they violated the agreement with their actions, and
That's
then
right.
it becomes null and void, and we're no longer obligated.
Yeah, and that's why I'm,
And putting that in
Hesitating
there,
a little
like,
bit.
heads up, this will happen, we will.
right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, normally you put in like a morality clause or something of the
Mhm.
sort, but the point is, and that would go in the contract for the naming rights, so maybe that's a little bit too detailed, but the concept around, we should consider the idea that we do not want to give unlimited, absolute, no choice naming rights.
I think so too. Even some just general statements in this, and that is potential to lose that,
Right.
through actions of.
I agree, and I would say that, something else that would kind of give us the opportunity to move on if we needed to is if that entity lost connection with the district. What if something like that, down the road, even though they gave us whatever, they moved on, that business closed down, whatever,
Sure.
and there's no connection or community, connection with that person or business, whatever it might be, I don't know if we wanna have something in there that we can rename it if we need to, because somebody else might come along and say, hey, I'm gonna give you $2 million to do some updates, can I get the
Right.
naming?
So some potential what ifs, just some umbrella language, but
Yeah.
then maybe some supplementary pieces, around what those should be. Again, because we're in the position to take time and think about it, because we're
Yeah.
not facing it right now.
Right, exactly. Best time for policy when you're not facing the issue.
Exactly, and I can also connect with people who've been in a situation recently from a
Right.
school entity, because, whether it's the new school, I think right now, North Green Bay or someone, don't quote me, they were trying to build and do that, and then you had huge protests around, the names and that kind of thing. So how do you write the policy language that gives us that authority?
And I think it's at a minimum procedurally just a reminder in the policy to whoever's drafting it to say, look, these are additional
This is possible.
considerations to,
And again, we have the gift of time in writing it, it's so when they come to those specific agreements, that they're thinking through all of these elements to guide that eventual agreement.
I mean, yeah, we could be facing that hopefully sooner than later with New Jackson, hopefully.
That'd be great.
If we keep it the same, maybe.
That'd be great, if I could have that donor, I need a football field, AstroTurf. There's a lot of opportunity
Yeah.
here, to
well,
your
and
point.
I don't want to make this restrictive, overly restrictive either. I mean, I think
Right.
it's just appropriate that we want to just make sure that everything is done decently, that's all.
Perfect, okay, I'm going to like I said, grab some of those, explore some procedural pieces that might be best placed in an AR, find us the out clause, so that it's generally discussed here, and then incorporate the financial in those obligations, things that should guide people as they look at entering agreements with others. So that's, and then I'll do some work to check in with other districts who have gone through this recently, and just, hey, what do you wish that you had had in place to guide you, those kinds of things, so that we're in attention to it.
Great.
Any other pieces on that one?
Down here.
All right,
Think we're
perfect.
good to go?
Then I'm gonna go for it. That was it. We made it through the
made it
rest
through
of
the
8
eights.
and 900s.
Oh, and the nines.
So 900, there's one, sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, wait a minute.
There's the one 900. So when you look at the 900, you have, it's just the run around retirement of facilities. So take a look at that. That is on its own, the retirement of facilities. So when you retire those, again, you would have faced this with Barton. I don't know the exact year that that one was retired, but this policy was in place. And again, building New Jackson, you're retiring that facility technically. Does that give you an opportunity? When is it considered retired?
I think for this one, the only thing I would add is under the cost section, or somewhere, maybe the fourth category is special benefits or perks. I mean, there are certain scenarios where the building, or the land that the building is on has been designated as a gift, or donated land for the exact purpose that it's being used for. And if you were to retire that facility, you would.
What are the implications of
you would
retirement?
lose the benefits of that property.
So look for some language around the implications of retirement beyond just cost
Right.
of that.
So that might make your decision, maybe you repurpose that building rather than retire that building, because then you don't lose the land that it's on or something.
Yep.
Otherwise, this makes sense.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
Yep, and I had Dave Ross take a look at it too, he's most one acclimated with that. There's nothing in here. I'll scout some language to your point, Chad, and bring that back then for the
What-
committee to take a look at.
What do we have around historical pieces of facilities? Isn't Park Jackson a historical?
Oh, you mean like a
Portion.
designated
Is it
historical?
formally designated?
Hmm.
I've not heard that.
I haven't heard that either, it's a good question.
I thought there was something,
The one part of the schoolhouse, the original schoolhouse from the 1800s is there, but I don't think it has a historical designation, because for us to be touching anything in there, we'd have to go through
and I don't think
multiple
it's
other
been
hoops.
changed.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's about- I'll double check to that,
yeah.
and I can put to Chad's point around special designations or something like that to be cognizant of.
I was just curious down the road what we would do with that if we had to, obviously, I don't even know, if there was something like that, I know Badger may have even fallen under that at some point, but probably wasn't designated because it was so old, it's the old high school.
And they, I think sometimes when you're doing that, you're taking a nod, what obligation are you under because of its designation? Or how do you take a nod from its history? So the original Badger, when you go inside, the owls, all of that, that's all part of the original structure and kind of meaning, and how do you do that? So even maybe salvage of materials from those sites if they've got that historical significance, to your point. Like if I vacate Jackson, I get a new building, what am I doing with the bell? What am I doing with the, where does that go, and how, either whether through designation or our historical significance for our district and how, you know, what salvage comes into play. So I'll take a look at some language around those things.
Right.
I know I've had a friend even just dealing with referenda on that, and they had this, kind of the same thing, and they were building around, and that became a point of angst for the community. I know in my former community, the letterhead for the district is the outline of this building, and when they were touching that, they had real clear parameters, and they chose not to vacate that building specifically. They tore down a different one entirely because of that historical,
It's
sentimental.
iconic.
It wasn't a, yeah, that's, I think that's the word, the iconic element. It wasn't a designation, but it was
Mhm.
iconic too.
Mhm.
So I'll look for some language around that.
Hmm.
I'll be doing some work on this, so if anything comes to mind on the ones that I'm doing work, just feel free to reach out
Okay.
outside the committee and let me know, and I can share that back with the rest of the committee. But I'll be bringing these pieces back then. That was your 1-900.
That's it for the 900s that we're reading,
That was it. We've now officially made it through.
All right, so we've discussed everything on our planned agenda,
Yep.
correct?
We did it. It's just bringing back those final ones before we bring these back to the full board.
All right, we've given you homework, thank
A
you.
little bit. That's okay.
All right, any final remarks? Any objections to adjourning? Nope. Thank you, members, for your work. Thank you, Superintendent Wimmer.
Yeah.
We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I was gonna say, John's got our technical. Thank you.